They called her the First Lady of Gospel, the voice that shook church rafters, crossed color lines, and carried millions through grief. Yet when the music stopped, the applause did not follow her home. In 1983, Shirley Caesar married the man who steadied her pulpit and her pulse. 31 years later, she buried him, and something else was lowered into the ground with him, the fragile piece she'd bought with a lifetime of sacrifice. What came next wasn't a chorus, it was a crossfire. Stepchildren who once sat in the front pew now stared across a courtroom. Siblings whispered that her mother's pain had become her platform. On the internet, strangers buried her again and again with rumors of cancer, collapse, and death. This is not a story about a fallen voice. It's a story about a woman who gave away most of what she earned, then watched the world take what was left. Before the headlines, there was a 7-year-old girl who sang to keep the lights on. Before the awards, there was a 19-year-old who walked out of a classroom because a calling wouldn't let her stay. Before the viral meme, there was a tour bus skidding on ice and a prayer whispered between breaths. Shirley Caesar didn't chase fame, she chased faith. But fame found her anyway and tested it. Tonight, we open a sealed file on a life that made history in public and paid for it in private. The question isn't how she rose. The question is how she kept standing when the stage turned against her. If you think you know Shirley Caesar, listen closely. The song isn't over. It's only moving to a lower key. And in the low notes, the truth is louder. Long before her name echoed through Grammy halls, Shirley Ann Caesar was just another barefoot girl running across the dirt roads of Durham, North Carolina. Born on October 13, 1938, she was the 10th of 13 children, a number that promised noise, hunger, and resilience. Her father, James Caesar, was a tobacco factory worker by day and a gospel singer by night. His voice, deep and thunderous, was known in every church corner of the Carolinas. But no matter how moving his songs were, they couldn't buy comfort for a family of 13. Their home was small, the kind of house where winter air slipped through the cracks and prayers replaced medicine. Shirley's mother, Hannah Caesar, had a partially paralyzed leg and spent most days in pain. Still, she found ways to stretch one loaf of bread into dinner for all. Every night, when her father rehearsed with his gospel quartet, the Just Come Four, Shirley would sit by the window, humming along. It wasn't music school that trained her voice, it was survival. Then, in 1945, everything broke. Her father collapsed one Sunday afternoon from a brain seizure. She was just 7. He died right there, she would later recall, and my childhood ended in that moment. Without her father's wages, the family had nothing. 13 mouths, one crippled mother, and no income. Shirley didn't have time to mourn. She had to sing. At an age when most children were learning their alphabet, Shirley was learning how to earn. She began performing in small churches around Durham, standing on wooden boxes so the congregation could see her face. Her voice, raw, trembling yet powerful, filled sanctuaries with something close to divine fire. People called her Baby Shirley. The name stuck, but the innocence behind it didn't last long. She became her family's provider, carrying groceries on one shoulder and gospel on the other. Those early years carved the foundation of everything she would become. They taught her that love is labor, that faith is forged in fire, and that music, when born from hunger, can shake heaven itself. By the time she turned 10, Shirley wasn't just singing, she was surviving through sound. and in the quiet between verses, she prayed that her voice would one day be enough to save them all. At 19, Shirley Caesar stood at a crossroads, one hand on a typewriter, the other on destiny. She had enrolled in college to study business, hoping to lift her family out of poverty. But one ordinary afternoon, during a typing test, the air in the classroom shifted. A voice, not human, not earthly, called her name. Once. Twice. Then, with clarity that pierced her bones, she heard the words, "Behold, I have called you from your mother's womb, and I have anointed your lips to preach the gospel." The next morning, she packed her books, walked out of class, and never returned. Her professors thought she had lost her mind, but Shirley knew she had found her purpose. In 1958, armed with nothing but faith and a voice that could rattle the heavens, she walked up to gospel legend Albertina Walker and declared she could sing all the parts. Walker laughed until Shirley opened her mouth. Within minutes, she was invited to join the Caravans, one of the most respected gospel groups in America. Her debut performance left the audience speechless. She didn't just sing, she testified. Her voice soared, cracked, and trembled like lightning in a bottle. While others sang for praise, one critic wrote later, Shirley Caesar sang for her life. Life on the road was brutal. The Caravans toured through the segregated Deep South, sleeping on buses, denied hotels, and sometimes performing for pennies. In Birmingham, they were turned away from 17 hotels in one night. In Mississippi, white police used hoses on black audiences. Yet Shirley never stopped. Every insult, every night spent hungry, became fuel for her fire. When preachers underpaid her, 50 cents for a week's work, she smiled and sang harder, because singing was her only way forward. By the early 1960s, Shirley's energy had become the soul of the Caravans. Crowds called her the Little Storm. On stage, she stomped her feet, shouted mid-song, and wept openly as if possessed by the Holy Spirit. Some elders thought it was too wild, too emotional, but young fans saw something revolutionary, a woman transforming gospel into living testimony. In 1963, she released her first solo track, I'd Rather Have Jesus. Record labels rejected it, saying she was too young to understand pain. So she sold the records herself, traveling from church to church with a one-legged preacher. Some nights she earned $5, others nothing, but she sang anyway. By the 1960s, Shirley had become a recognized name. But in 1966, she was ready to stand alone. She had carried the group's spirit, but now she wanted her own wings. When she asked for equal pay and creative control, Walker refused. So she walked away, broke, brave, and burning with conviction. Everyone told her she'd fail. Mahalia Jackson herself warned her not to go solo. But the girl who once sang to keep the lights on had already faced worse than failure. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing freedom. And freedom, for Shirley Caesar, was worth every risk. When Shirley Caesar walked away from the Caravans in 1966, the gospel world thought she'd just signed her own obituary. But what looked like an ending was really the prelude to one of gospel's greatest resurrections. She signed a solo deal with Hob Records, a $50,000 contract, unheard of for a black woman in gospel at the time. Everyone said it was a mistake. Yet when her first album, My Testimony, 1967, hit the shelves, something extraordinary happened. The songs weren't polished hymns. They were raw cries from the heart. She sang about poverty, racism, doubt, and the thin line between faith and despair. Critics were confused, but the people, ordinary churchgoers, working mothers, and the brokenhearted, understood. They saw their own pain in her voice. She didn't sing about God, one journalist wrote. She sang to him, like she was arguing with heaven itself. By 1969, her authenticity had become her weapon. She recorded live with Reverend James Cleveland, the same man who had worked with Aretha Franklin. Their collaboration, born spontaneously during a church service, sent shockwaves through the gospel scene. The crowd that night said the floor felt like it was shaking. The recording, released as I'll Go, captured something no studio could manufacture, the sound of faith fighting back against fear. But behind the applause, Shirley was still fighting the same old battles. Producers told her to soften her voice. Promoters printed her face smaller than male headliners. Record labels made her seek male approval before releasing songs. Even when she sold out concert halls, her name was printed under special guest. She didn't argue. She just sang louder. When her first Grammy nomination came in 1969, everyone expected her to win. But the award went elsewhere. And later, whispers began. It was said that a rival artist's manager had manipulated the votes. The loss stung, not because of pride, but because Shirley knew what it meant for every black woman trying to claim her space in sacred music. Still, she pressed forward. In 1971, she finally won her first Grammy for Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man from Galilee. It was a song originally recorded by Anne Murray, a pop artist, but Shirley's version was drenched in spirit and sorrow. When she stepped onto that Grammy stage, surrounded by pop idols and secular stars, she began her speech with 5 words that silenced the room. First, I want to thank God. In that moment, she didn't just accept an award, she redefined the space gospel could occupy in American culture. But not everyone celebrated. Traditionalists accused her of polluting gospel with mainstream rhythms. Pastors said her songs were too close to R&B, too worldly. But Shirley refused to apologize. If it sounds like the world, she told one interviewer, that's because the world needs to hear it. Through the 1970s, she continued to push boundaries. Her performances became legendary, half concert, half revival. Audiences would cry, shout, even collapse under the emotion. One journalist wrote that seeing Shirley Caesar live was like watching a preacher battle demons in real time. In 1975, she took that fire overseas, to West Africa. More than 250,000 people gathered in open fields to hear her sing. They walked for days, barefoot, hungry, but filled with faith. Shirley, overwhelmed by the poverty she saw, broke down mid-song and began to pray. Lord, she whispered, these people remind me of home. The trip changed her. It was no longer enough to just sing about salvation. She wanted to live it. That same year, she expanded her ministry in the U.S., creating the Shirley Caesar Outreach Program, a charity that provided food and shelter for poor families in North Carolina. She gave away half her concert income, then 60%, then 75%. Friends called her reckless. But to Shirley, generosity wasn't optional. It was sacred duty. By 1978, she shocked the industry again with her album Message for the People. It blended gospel with funk, horns and electric bass, a sonic rebellion. Pastors denounced it from the pulpit. The audience, however, adored it. The album went platinum, making her one of the first gospel artists to ever sell over 1 million copies. Suddenly, secular radio stations were playing her songs. Record executives who once ignored her were now begging for collaborations. Her success reached beyond gospel circles. She appeared on The Mike Douglas Show, where millions of white viewers saw a gospel woman perform with unfiltered, church-born intensity. She didn't tone it down. She danced, shouted, and waved her tambourine as if she was still back in Durham's wooden chapel. CBS received thousands of calls that night, half complaints, half conversions. Shirley had brought the sound of the black church into America's living rooms. But for Shirley Caesar, fame was never the finish line. Every new platform became another pulpit. Every song was a sermon. By the early 1980s, she had won multiple Grammys, her voice had become the anthem of the movement, and her faith, the same faith that began in a broken tobacco town, had lifted her to global stages. She had broken barriers of race, gender, and religion. But with every step higher, the air grew thinner. Because in the next act of her life, the spotlight that once had lifted her up would turn blinding. And when it did, the cost of being the First Lady of Gospel would come due, one heartbreak at a time. By the time the 1980s arrived, Shirley Caesar was untouchable, or so it seemed. She had conquered gospel, crossed into pop culture, and built a reputation so spotless that people whispered her name in church pews with reverence. But in the shadows behind the stage lights, life was tightening its grip. The woman who sang about grace was about to be tested by everything unholy. In 1983, Shirley's life collided with both love and tragedy. That summer, she married Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, a man whose devotion to God matched her own. Together, they built the Mount Calvary Word of Faith Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, a ministry that drew thousands. Their wedding was radiant. Her ring had 9 diamonds, each representing a spiritual gift. For the first time, Shirley allowed herself to believe she had found peace. But peace in her story never stayed long. Just months after the wedding, her tour bus hit a patch of ice and spun out of control. As the vehicle tumbled, Shirley felt the world slow into silence. She later said she saw the other side, a moment suspended between life and death. Paramedics revived her, and when she finally awoke, her first words were a prayer. That brush with death inspired her to write "Jesus, I Love Calling Your Name," a song that would become one of the most played funeral hymns in America. Each time she performed it, tears filled her eyes. She wasn't just singing. She was remembering the day she almost left this world. The late 1980s tested her more deeply than the segregated South ever had. While most churches refused to even speak about AIDS, Shirley opened her doors to the dying. She ordered her congregation to feed, visit, and bury those whom the world had abandoned. Some church elders called it sin. Others threatened to leave. Anonymous letters warned her to stop touching the cursed. She didn't listen. Jesus loves everyone, she told them. And quietly, her ministry cared for more than 200 families ravaged by the epidemic. She didn't announce it on TV or in magazines. She simply did what faith demanded. But the endless touring, preaching, and giving came with a price. By 1989, Shirley's voice, the same thunder that had carried her through decades, began to falter. Doctors found nodules on her vocal cords. She took steroid injections just to make it through shows. Her Live in Chicago album, recorded while she was in pain, would later win her Artist of the Decade at the Stellar Awards, though that night she could barely speak her acceptance. The irony was brutal. Her body was breaking just as her career reached perfection. Then the betrayals began. After her mother's death in the early 1990s, family tensions turned poisonous. Her siblings accused her of using her mother's suffering to gain fame, even claiming her tribute album was a money grab. The woman who had given everything to her family now found herself exiled by them. One by one, her brothers and sisters passed away, leaving her as the last survivor of 13. "The hardest sound," she once said, "is silence in a house that used to be full." When her Bishop Williams died in 2014, that silence grew unbearable. The man who had shared her pulpit for 31 years was gone. Thousands attended his funeral, but when the crowd left, Shirley faced something worse than grief: betrayal from within. Her 2 stepchildren, whom she had raised as her own, turned on her in a vicious estate battle. They fought over church property, assets, and power. Court papers were filed, accusations flew. Shirley, the woman who had preached forgiveness to millions, now sat alone in her Raleigh home, forced to defend herself against her own family. And the world was watching. Rumors began to spread, lies that she was dying, broke, or bitter. The internet resurrected her death every few months. Shirley Caesar dead at 85. Gospel icon loses her voice to throat cancer. Each time she had to record a video just to prove she was alive. "Unless I'm a living dead person, I don't know anything about it," she laughed weakly. But laughter couldn't quiet the pain. False reports accused her of stealing church money, $2.3 million they claimed. Others said she had plagiarized songs,
cheated musicians, even hidden a secret son. None of it was true. Independent audits cleared her completely, but the stains remained. In a cruel twist, social media, the same force that had made her You Name It challenge go viral in 2016, now turned into her tormentor. By 2020, Shirley was 81. She had survived segregation, sexism, and scandal. But the wounds closest to home hurt most. My greatest tragedy, she confessed, wasn't losing my voice, it was losing my family. And yet, even then, she refused to stop preaching. Sunday after Sunday, she stood in her church, frail but fierce, declaring hope to those who'd already buried her online. Each sermon sounded like a farewell, but her eyes still burned with fight. For Shirley Caesar, faith was no longer just a message, it was armor. Because after decades of saving others, the only soul left to save was her own. By the mid-2010s, Shirley Caesar had survived everything the world could throw at her. Poverty, prejudice, exhaustion, betrayal. But when Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, her husband and life's anchor, passed away on July 4, 2014, the ground beneath her finally gave way. They had shared 31 years of marriage, 31 years of preaching side by side, singing together, and building their 1,500-member church from the soil of faith. When he was gone, her Raleigh home, once filled with prayer meetings and laughter, fell silent. "I still wait for him to walk through the door," she told a friend. "Then I remember, he's already home." Grief didn't come softly. It came like a storm. Within months, the family that should have comforted her fractured beyond repair. Her stepchildren, Harold Jr. and Hope, began a bitter legal battle over their father's estate and church properties. Papers were filed, lawyers called, whispers turned to headlines. For the woman who had spent a lifetime preaching unity, this was a crucifixion of the heart. Still, the world expected her to sing. So she did. But every note carried the tremor of loneliness. On stage, she was radiant. Off stage, she was hollowed out by loss. And then, like vultures circling a wounded figure, false rumors began to feed. In 2016, her vintage sermon, Hold My Mule, resurfaced online, remixed into a viral meme, the You Name It challenge. Suddenly, millions were dancing to her voice, laughing to her rhythm. But as fame returned in laughter, pain followed in lies. Fake obituaries declared she had died from throat cancer. YouTube channels used photographs of hospital patients and claimed they were her final moments. Fans sent flowers to her home, thinking it was a memorial. Shirley finally addressed the chaos herself. "Unless I'm a living dead person," she said with a tired smile, "I don't know anything about it." The internet that once revived her career had now turned into a graveyard built from pixels and cruelty. Worse came in 2018 when a fabricated story accused her of embezzling millions from the church. Tabloids printed it, gossip blogs spread it. People she'd once mentored stopped calling. An independent audit later proved her innocence. She had donated her own money to cover church debts. But by then the damage was done. Even the music press turned on her. Old tracks were picked apart by bloggers who accused her of stealing songs from forgotten artists of the 1970s. Lawsuits threatened to erase decades of integrity. Exhausted and humiliated, Shirley considered walking away from the pulpit for good. But every time despair came, she remembered the 7-year-old girl singing to keep her family fed. She remembered the bus crash, the hunger, the cold nights in segregated stations. That child, that survivor, wouldn't allow her to quit. And so she returned to the stage. Older, smaller, but unbroken. She sang softer now, almost whispering, as if her voice had learned the cost of every word. By 2020, the world was mourning again. This time not her death, but its own cruelty. Shirley, at 86, still stood every Sunday at Mount Calvary Word of Faith, her church filled with believers who refused to believe the lies. She was proof that even when the world writes your ending, faith can rewrite it. Her tragedy wasn't that she fell, it was that she had to rise so many times alone.
In the stillness of her 86th year, Shirley Caesar stands as living proof that faith can outlast fame and that grace doesn't need an audience. Every Sunday morning in Raleigh, North Carolina, her voice still rises from the pulpit of Mount Calvary Word of Faith Church, a little weaker perhaps, but still carrying the same fire that began in a child's heart more than 7 decades ago. She doesn't tour as much now. The lights are dimmer, the crowd's smaller, but when she sings, the air itself seems to tremble. "He's working it out for you," she whispers, and the congregation erupts, not because of who she was, but because of what she still is, a survivor, a servant, a vessel. Over a career spanning 7 decades, Shirley Caesar has earned 11 Grammy Awards, 14 Stellar Awards, and countless honors, including the National Heritage Fellowship, the highest U.S. award for traditional artists. Yet when asked about her legacy, she doesn't speak of trophies, she speaks of souls. "If one person found hope in my voice," she once said, "then I've done my job." Her generosity has become legend. More than 75% of her earnings given away to charity, millions of dollars funneled quietly into food programs, homeless shelters, and scholarships. She still lives in the same modest home she shared with Bishop Williams. The profits from her small Durham store go entirely to families in need during the holidays. She has mentored an entire generation, from Yolanda Adams to Kirk Franklin, urging them to protect their anointing even when the industry dangled fame. To them, she was not just the first lady of gospel, she was the conscience of it. And yet, beneath all the honors, the laughter, the viral fame, Shirley's story is not about music. It's about endurance, about how a girl from Durham turned pain into praise, betrayal into belief, and tragedy into testimony. "I've lost much," she says softly, "but I never lost my song."
Under the fading glow of the spotlight, the camera lingers on Shirley Caesar, frail but unbroken. Her hands tremble as she adjusts the microphone, the church silent, waiting. Then she smiles. The same smile that has weathered loss, betrayal, and rebirth, and whispers the words that have carried her through every storm. "God's not through with me yet." The lights dim. Her voice, now a soft echo, fills the screen one last time, half hymn, half heartbeat. In a world that measures worth by applause, Shirley Caesar reminds us that true greatness isn't what the world gives you, it's what the world can't take away. Because when the fame fades and the crowds go home, what remains is faith. And faith, when sung through fire, never dies. This is the untold story of Shirley Caesar. If you believe stories like hers still matter, share this one before the music stops again.